Welcome to Justice Reloaded HD. Sometimes, a child doesn't need to be fixed. They don't even need to be carried. They just need someone to accept the quiet way they ask for safety, even if that means sitting somewhere no one else thinks they belong. Today's story is about a waitress who didn't pull her feet away, and a man who had never let anyone that close to his heart. If you've ever let someone rest on a part of your life, not because it was convenient, but because they simply needed peace, then this story is for you. Like and subscribe to Justice Reloaded HD. And stay with us until the end, because what's touched today isn't just the floor beneath someone's feet. It's the quiet kind of trust that asks to be held, and doesn't need to be explained. Not every place is a seat. But sometimes, someone becomes one, just so someone else can feel safe enough to stop trembling. It was the kind of restaurant you only read about in magazines. Glass walls that caught the city lights like a net of stars. Waiters dressed like groomsmen. Every plate a sculpture. Every chair a calculated part of some billionaire's vision of elegance. Tonight was a private event, a birthday celebration for someone whose name turned heads, though most in the room were there more for the photo ops than the cake. The host was Victor Langley, a 63-year-old media mogul with salt-gray hair and a spine that never bent. He was a man who believed in order, who hated emotional messes, and who had once fired a senior editor for crying during a meeting. Victor didn't do chaos. He curated control. The guests were curated too. Actors, politicians, high-dollar donors. The music played at the exact volume where no one had to raise their voice. Every table had a name card. Every moment, a purpose. Which is why no one noticed the little boy at first. He came in with a nanny, a quiet woman in her 40s wearing a conservative navy blue dress and eyes that darted more than they looked. The boy, maybe 6 or 7, had fine blonde hair and the delicate posture of someone used to holding pain. His name was Asher. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. He didn't sit in the velvet chair assigned to him. Instead, Asher lowered himself carefully to the floor near a side counter, his back leaning slightly against a wall, his limbs curling inward like a question no one had answered yet. One leg stretched out, the other tucked awkwardly beneath him. It was clear he couldn't stay like that long. His bones shifted too often, his breathing tightened. And yet, no one stepped in. People noticed him, yes. But they noticed the way you notice a flickering light in a hallway, inconvenient, not urgent enough to fix. He was outside the spotlight. Outside the plan. And that's when she appeared. Mara was new. 28, quiet, hired 2 weeks earlier with little fanfare. She moved through the dining room like a shadow that never brushed against anyone's conversation. She never offered more than required. But if anyone had bothered to look past the tray in her hands, they might have seen something soft in the way her eyes scanned the room, not for celebrities, but for needs unspoken. She was carrying a tray of champagne flutes when she saw him. The boy on the floor. The way his arms trembled ever so slightly. The way he blinked, not in panic, but in endurance. She didn't ask permission. She didn't call for help. She set her tray down on the sideboard with steady hands, walked over to him, and without a word, she sat. Right there on the polished floor, next to a child no one had made room for. She crossed her legs slowly, deliberately, and gave the faintest nod, not to him but to herself. Asher looked up, eyes wide but not alarmed. He studied her, like someone trying to remember something he hadn't been taught. Then, with a movement that felt more like surrender than choice, he crawled the few inches forward and settled onto her legs. His body fit into the curve of her lap like it had been waiting for something shaped exactly like her to exist. And then, nothing. He didn't cry. He didn't flinch. He just stopped shaking. The music went on. The party buzzed. But in that one corner of the room, stillness took hold, not heavy, not loud. Just real. And it was real enough that for a few strange seconds, time itself seemed to pause. She didn't speak. She didn't smile. She became a place. And for the first time in what might have been a long while, Asher didn't need to escape. Some actions are so small, no one gets the chance to stop them. But they're big enough to make an entire room fall silent. At first, no one quite knew what to do with the image taking shape in the corner of the grand dining hall. A child, silent and fragile, sitting cross-legged on the floor, not on a chair, not on a cushion, but on the legs of a waitress. A young woman in black slacks and a starched apron, who sat without fanfare, without protest, with the poise of someone who had decided that comfort was more important than protocol. It was a disruption. A quiet one, but a disruption all the same. And so, the machinery of order began to twitch. The restaurant manager, a tall man in his 40s with the face of someone who had practiced smiling in a mirror but never quite got it right, spotted the scene from across the room. His brow furrowed instantly, not in cruelty, but in reflex. This was a 5-star venue. A PR-heavy event. Everything gleamed. Nothing, absolutely nothing, was meant to touch the floor. He made his way over with the stiff urgency of someone who hated confrontation but hated deviation even more. Mara saw him coming. She didn't move. Asher was still. His small frame pressed softly into her lap, one hand limp at his side, the other barely grazing her apron. His face, once a fragile mask of effort, had gone slack with calm. Not asleep. Just unburdened. The manager stepped closer. His lips parted, breath caught halfway between instruction and hesitation. Before he could speak, Mara did something. She raised one hand, gently without rush, and placed it on the boy's shoulder. Not to hold him. Not to protect him. Just to let him know she was still there. And Asher responded not with words, but with something far more intimate. He tilted his head, slow as dawn, and rested his cheek against the side of her dress, the soft cotton fabric that smelled faintly of lemons and dish soap and something warm. His eyes didn't close, but they no longer searched. That gesture, as simple as gravity, changed the air. The manager hesitated. His voice never made it past his throat. His hand twitched toward his radio, then didn't move again. Another waiter, a younger one, high energy, with a kind of ambition that made him iron his sleeves 3 times, noticed and started to step in. A single foot forward. But before he could interrupt, a voice stopped him cold. "Leave it." It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Victor Langley sat at the main table, a half-finished glass of wine in front of him, untouched. His words didn't rise above the ambient jazz, but they cut through it just the same. He didn't look at the waiter. His eyes were on the corner, locked on the scene like a man watching something he never thought he'd see outside a memory. The waiter froze, confused, then nodded and backed off. And just like that, for a beat or two, maybe longer, the room changed. The din of silverware slowed. Conversations dipped, then stuttered. People glanced over shoulders, their eyes drawn to the quiet anomaly. No shouting. No spectacle. Just a boy, leaning into someone who had dared to make space where there was none. The lights above didn't dim. The music didn't stop. But the pulse of the room softened. The moment passed quickly. The party resumed. Waiters circulated with their trays. Laughter bubbled up again. But not everyone returned to the moment before. A few eyes kept drifting to the corner, not out of judgment, but curiosity. Maybe envy. Maybe wonder. What kind of person becomes a place for someone else, without needing to explain it? Victor didn't speak again. He didn't need to. Victor Langley sat at the head of the long table, the weight of his tailored suit resting against the stiff leather chair imported from Florence. His gold watch, a vintage piece passed down through 3 generations of cold ambition, caught the chandelier's light with every subtle twitch of his wrist. Around him, the air buzzed with laughter, clinking glasses, and industry talk wrapped in velvet tones. He didn't hear any of it. His eyes had locked onto something across the room, something he couldn't categorize. Victor had made a life out of knowing where to look. In newsrooms, boardrooms, and live interviews, he'd always kept his gaze exactly where it mattered. But now, his vision refused to play by those rules. It kept drifting, no anchoring, to the far corner of the room. To the boy. And the waitress. Asher hadn't moved much since he settled into the curve of Mara's lap. His small frame was still, like a pond untouched by wind. The way his cheek pressed into her dress, it wasn't desperation. It was permission. And Mara, for her part, sat like a statue carved not of stone, but something softer. Something human. Victor's fork rested beside his plate, untouched. His glass remained full. His chest felt tight, not in pain, not quite, but as if breathing too deeply might shatter the moment. He hadn't noticed how shallow his breaths had become. Around him, people spoke his name. They laughed in his direction. A woman tapped his arm lightly to mention a senator's recent scandal. He nodded, though he hadn't heard the sentence. Because in that corner, that soft, unremarkable sliver of flooring near a sideboard, something real was happening. Something unscripted. He had built empires on the premise that everything could be edited, reframed, cropped, managed. But nothing about what he was seeing now had been filtered. There were no cameras on them. No lights. No performance. Just a boy who didn't speak. A woman who didn't move. And a kind of connection that no amount of money had ever bought Victor Langley in his 63 years. The room felt like it had two separate temperatures. The gala, bright and loud and manicured, and that corner, quiet and breathless. A man seated to Victor's left, a longtime business partner, lean and loud, the kind who always smelled like imported cologne and closing deals, leaned in and asked, "You all right, Vic?" Victor blinked. He turned his head slowly, like someone waking up from underwater. "I don't," he began, then stopped. He looked back toward the boy, then to his plate, then away again. "I don't know what just happened." His voice was lower than usual. Less certain. The kind of voice that didn't belong to a man who built cable networks and crushed competitors before breakfast. The partner chuckled awkwardly, not sure what to make of the moment. "Yeah. Cute kid, I guess. Little odd, but..." Victor didn't answer. He didn't have the words. Not because the moment was too poetic, but because it had broken through in a language he'd never learned. What did you call it, when someone who never asked for anything finally found rest, and all it took was someone else giving up the idea of being proper? What do you do when you realize someone just became safe, and it had nothing to do with the right security detail or the best therapist or the most prestigious school? Victor had spent his life in high-backed chairs, private jets, boardroom suites with thick glass walls. He had lived above everything. But now he was staring at a boy who had found peace not by climbing up, but by someone else choosing to come down to the floor. And for some reason, Victor couldn't stop watching. The ride home was unusually silent. Victor Langley sat in the back of his black sedan, city lights flickering across the tinted windows like thoughts he couldn't catch. His tie was loosened. His jaw tense. He hadn't touched his phone. Not once. A rare occurrence for a man whose world usually ticked in 15-minute blocks and calendar notifications. His assistant, seated in the front passenger seat, was scrolling through messages when Victor finally spoke. "The girl who served table 6, he said, voice flat but not casual. "What's her name?" The assistant turned, surprised. "The waitress." Victor didn't respond. Just looked out the window. "We don't have a full staff list for temps," the assistant added, flipping open a folder from the event planner. "I think she was brought in last minute. Worked 2 or 3 shifts. That's all I've got." Victor nodded once, barely. A few seconds passed. "And the boy?" he asked, almost too quietly. "The kid?" The assistant hesitated, sensing something deeper behind the question. He was a guest of one of the partners' families. Apparently has a condition. Something to do with his bones or joints. Doesn't talk. Victor said nothing. But his posture changed. He slumped back slightly into the leather seat, as if his body had finally caught up to the weight inside him. The car kept moving. Traffic was light. The city was alive in all the ways Victor suddenly didn't care about. He didn't know why he was asking. Or maybe he did, and just wasn't ready to admit it. Back at the house, he didn't head straight to his study like he usually did. He didn't change out of his suit. He didn't pour himself a drink. Instead, he sat on the edge of his living room sofa, phone in hand. He stared at the screen for a moment, thumb hovering. Then slowly, deliberately, he dialed. The phone rang twice before a voice answered. Dad. It was his eldest son. 31 now. Successful. Married. Calm. A man who had grown out of panic attacks the way some people grow out of allergies, slowly, and with too many scars to count. Victor's voice was steadier than he expected. Hey. You have a minute. Of course, his son said, already sensing the strange tone. Everything okay? Victor exhaled through his nose, a sound more tired than annoyed. When you were little, he began, then paused. He rubbed at the bridge of his nose, as if clearing a fog that wasn't there. When you had those episodes. The anxiety. The freezing up. Did anyone ever just sit with you? There was a silence on the other end. Not confusion, just thought. I mean, his son said slowly, Mom tried. Sometimes. But I usually ended up alone. You were always working. I don't blame you, he added quickly. It was just how things were. Victor closed his eyes. His son didn't say it to hurt him. He said it because it was true. And it was that truth, clean, unspoken, without accusation, that cut deeper than any insult ever could. Victor leaned forward, elbows on knees, the phone still pressed to his ear. Tonight, he said, I saw a boy sit on someone's lap. Not because he was invited. Not because anyone told him he could. But because she didn't move. He paused. And no one stopped her. Not even me. His son was quiet again. Sounds like he found what he needed, he said finally. That's rare. Victor nodded, even though no one could see him. His hand was trembling slightly. Not from age. Not from weakness. From something older than both. From the realization that he had spent a lifetime building fortresses, but had never once thought about being a place someone else could simply rest. Victor returned to the restaurant the next afternoon. It wasn't planned. Not really. His calendar had other priorities, as always, meetings, calls, a working lunch with potential investors. But somewhere between buttoning his shirt and stepping into the car, he told his assistant to cancel the afternoon. Something came up, he said. And that was the only explanation he gave. The same grand dining room was quieter now. Daylight streamed in through the tall windows, making the polished floors seem less like a stage and more like a mirror. The staff moved with the relaxed pace of pre-service. There were no guests. No noise. No eyes. He scanned the room once. She wasn't there. But someone pointed him toward the back, near the prep area. Not the kitchen, just a corridor where waitstaff stored trays and glass racks. She was sitting on a bench, tying her shoes. Mara. She looked up when he approached, but didn't stand. Didn't smile. Just met his gaze with the same calm presence she'd had the night before. Victor didn't bother with introductions. Where did you learn to do that? He asked. Her brow furrowed slightly. Do what? That thing you did with the boy. Letting him, he gestured vaguely, his hand unsure. Sit like that. Mara looked at him for a moment. Not defensive. Not confused. Just quiet. I didn't learn it, she said. I remember it. He blinked. Remember what? She glanced down at her hands. There was a time when I was little. I don't even remember why I was on the floor. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I just didn't want to be seen. I sat there for a long time. And people walked past. Everyone did. No one stopped. No one asked. She paused, her voice still even. All I wanted, she said, was for someone to sit down with me. Not to fix me. Not to ask what was wrong. Just to let me lean on them, without needing to explain myself. Victor stood still. It wasn't a rehearsed story. She didn't tell it for sympathy. There was no crescendo, no moral pitch. Just truth. Plain and bare, like her posture, like her silence. He swallowed. You knew that, boy? She shook her head. No. I didn't need to. Then why? He trailed off. She met his eyes again. Because he needed quiet. And I had it. For a man used to answers, sharp, actionable, monetized answers, her simplicity felt almost cruel in its clarity. Victor had always believed in roles. Who serves, who speaks, who leads, who listens. But Mara had abandoned all that in a single act that broke every rule and still felt more right than anything he'd seen in years. She stood then, brushing off her apron. Not out of nervousness. Just out of readiness. He watched her for a beat, unsure what to say next. You could have gotten in trouble, he offered, unsure why he said it. She tilted her head slightly. Probably. Why risk that? She offered the smallest shrug. Sometimes, giving someone a place to rest is more important than keeping your place. Victor looked down. Then up again. I don't think I've ever done that, he admitted. Mara didn't respond with praise or pity. She simply said, then maybe it's not too late. The Children's Center didn't have a sign that announced its purpose. There were no branded banners, no cheerful slogans painted on the walls. Just a simple white building tucked between a grocery store and a pharmacy, easy to miss unless you were looking for it. But Victor Langley had found it, or rather, he had asked someone to find it for him. He didn't tell anyone he was coming. No entourage. No photographers. No press release. He stepped through the glass doors like a man walking into a world he wasn't sure he belonged to. The receptionist didn't recognize him, which he found strangely comforting. She simply smiled and pointed him down a hallway when he asked if Mara used to work there. The hallway opened into a quiet room filled with soft floor mats and scattered wooden toys. Natural light streamed in through the windows, casting warm patterns on the carpet. There were no desks. No podiums. Just small bodies in various states of movement and stillness. Children sat or lay across the floor, some playing, some curled inward. But what struck Victor most was the adults, not standing above them, not instructing or correcting, but sitting with them. On the floor. Next to them. Letting them be. He paused in the doorway, unsure whether to enter. To his left, a boy, maybe 6, was refusing to sit in a chair. A staff member nearby didn't push him, didn't coax. She simply lowered herself to the floor beside him, crossing her legs. Within seconds, the boy moved closer, then casually slid into her lap without a word. She didn't flinch. She didn't react like she'd won something. She just stayed. Victor's breath caught in his chest. His eyes scanned the room. He saw another child tapping the floor rhythmically, and a volunteer next to him tapping along, never interrupting. Further down, a teenage girl leaned against the side of an adult who simply allowed it. No questions, no rules. This wasn't therapy the way Victor had known it. This was presence. Undemanding. Unthreatening. Undone from the idea of fixing. He stood there longer than he meant to. Long enough that his hands began to tremble, his throat tightening. He gripped the doorframe, knuckles pale, forcing breath into his lungs in small, steady pulls. He didn't understand why this hit so hard. Or maybe he did. Because in all the years he'd built empires, funded programs, issued speeches about inclusion and mental health, he'd never once considered what it looked like to simply sit down. Not metaphorically. Not in a press release. Literally. To sit down next to someone who needed to know they weren't below you, Not in that moment. He stepped inside. No one turned to look. No one gasped or whispered his name. Victor walked slowly across the room, finding a spot near the wall. A small boy nearby was stacking foam blocks with intense concentration. Victor didn't interrupt him. He didn't speak. He just lowered himself to the ground. The leather of his jacket creaked. His knees protested. But he stayed. Hands in his lap. Back straight. And for once in his life, not trying to be seen, but trying to see. A few feet away, the boy glanced at him briefly, then returned to his blocks. Victor smiled. His hands still trembled, but he didn't hide them. He exhaled, long and steady. For the first time in a very long time, he wasn't standing. And it didn't feel like defeat. It felt like arrival. There was no ribbon-cutting ceremony. No media coverage. No social media post. No plaque with Victor Langley's name engraved on it. Just a quiet corner of a children's center, newly carpeted with soft, forgiving material. The room didn't look like much: some mats, a few beanbags, and low shelves with plush toys. But it had been designed for one thing only: presence without pressure. They called it soft ground. Not officially. There was no sign that said it. But the staff used the phrase, and it stuck: a place where kids could sit, lie down, crawl, curl, or do nothing at all. They could sit on a lap. They could press against a wall. They could sit on someone's feet if they needed to. No rules. No time limits. No questions. Victor funded it without a word to the press. No cameras. No conditions. He didn't want to control it. He just wanted it to exist. The first time he returned, he stood in the doorway. He didn't enter. He just watched. It was a Wednesday afternoon. Children wandered in and out as they pleased. Some sat alone. Some sat with adults. Some didn't sit at all, just paced quietly, or hummed to themselves, or touched the same corner of the wall again and again. There were no corrections. Only companionship. He spotted Mara sitting on the floor, her legs folded beneath her like they had been that night at the restaurant. She wasn't facilitating anything. Just being there. A steady point in the room. And then Victor saw him. Asher. The boy entered without sound. A different outfit. The same eyes. He walked in slowly, his steps careful, as if measuring the space. He held a small folding chair, one of the plastic ones used for music time or coloring. He carried it across the room and placed it near Mara. But he didn't sit. He looked at the chair, touched the seat, then turned. His gaze searched, not the room but her. And then, without a word, Asher walked over to Mara, paused, and lowered himself down, not onto the mat, not onto the chair, but onto her feet. The same way he had the first time. Mara didn't flinch. She didn't acknowledge it like it was anything remarkable. She just remained. Asher leaned slightly into her shin, his posture relaxed, his breath even. No one clapped. No one pointed. But Victor, standing at the edge of the room, felt his chest tighten in the same way it had that night. Except this time, it wasn't from confusion. It was from recognition. This wasn't just a moment. It was a return. A quiet kind of homecoming, not to a place, but to a person. To a presence. To the shape of safety someone had once made for you, and was still willing to be. Victor didn't step closer. He didn't need to. He simply stood still, watching a boy settle into a space that had no name, but was his. And for once, he didn't need to breathe deeply to stay in the moment. He just stayed. In a world that praises strength, speed, and certainty, we often forget the quiet power of simply being still, especially for someone else. This story wasn't about grand gestures. No one gave a speech. No one rescued a child in dramatic fashion. It was about a young woman who made space, without asking questions, without demanding answers. And in doing so, she reminded everyone watching that comfort is not always a chair, and safety is not always a place. Sometimes, safety is a person. A presence. For older audiences, those who have spent decades building, providing, protecting, this story strikes a different chord. Many of us were raised to value independence, to believe that needing help was weakness. We were taught to stand tall, to push through, to never be a burden. But here lies a quieter truth. Real strength sometimes means not standing up. It means sitting down, beside someone in pain, in fear, or in silence, and choosing to stay, even when you don't know what to say. It means offering your presence, not your solutions. The billionaire in the story spent a lifetime at the top. Power, prestige, control, all were his. But none of that taught him how to make someone feel safe. That lesson came not through wealth, but through watching a woman let a boy sit on her feet because that was where he felt calm. Not appropriate. Not logical. Just needed. And isn't that what we all long for, in the quiet corners of our lives? To be allowed to rest without explanation? To lean on someone without being asked, "What's wrong with you?" To be given a moment of peace without feeling like we have to earn it? As we grow older, we begin to see that some of the most important things we can give to the next generation are not lectures or legacies, but presence. Not answers, but acceptance. Not control, but compassion. You don't have to be wealthy to create a soft ground. You don't have to build a center or start a program. Sometimes it's enough to let someone, a child, a friend, a stranger, know that they can sit near you, lean on you, and you will not pull away. Because the most lasting comfort is not built with money, or rules, or credentials. It's built when someone says, "You don't have to be okay for me to stay." And in a world that rarely gives people permission to be messy, that may be the bravest thing any of us can do. If you've ever let someone rest on the tired part of your life, just to give them a moment of peace. If you've ever had nothing to say, but still stayed without pulling away, then remember this. Some people don't need a seat. They need someone who's willing to be one. Like and subscribe to Justice Reloaded HD. And tell us, who was the one who stayed, so you didn't have to stand alone?